Coming off of Apex Legends, Respawn turned their focus back to another single-player experience, but this time with the Star Wars license wrapped around it. Titanfall 2 not only offered great multiplayer modes, but it offered one of the best single-player, first-person shooter campaigns in years, with a stellar story and a companion that had more heart and personality than many human characters in other games. But can Respawn do it once again? This time with the added pressure of pleasing action game fans and Star Wars fans alike. Respawn have delivered an enjoyable third-person action game that does the license justice. It borrows heavily from other games in terms of its mechanics and combat, whilst delivering a story which is interesting without it being anything truly remarkable. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but Jedi Fallen Order never surpasses those it wishes to emulate. If you're a lover of Star Wars or action games, then Jedi Fallen Order will scratch an itch you have, but I feel that simply having a great single-player Star Wars game has overshadowed some of the flaws it definitely has. Respawn have done a very good job overall. It's fun, it's enjoyable, it's pretty, and has fun combat, but it never reaches the heights of the games it has looked to for inspiration. You play a Padawan by the name of Cal Kestis, and the game is set after Episode 3, but before Episode 4. So between the movies of Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, and at the end of the Clone Wars. This is the time where Darth Sidious issued Order 66, which would see the clone army kill off the Jedi Order. Inquisitors were then dispatched to hunt down any remaining Jedi throughout the galaxy, and that's where we begin the game as Cal Kestis, hiding out on a remote planet when the Empire show up to look for the rumoured Jedi who is there. Throughout the story, you'll come face to face with friends and foes alike, and it's better to know as little as possible when it comes to how things play out. The story starts with a bang, but then I thought it trailed off a little once the first couple of hours was done, then it picked up again later on. I enjoyed the story, but never felt it went above and beyond anything that we've already experienced before, whether that be within the Star Wars universe or other single-player campaigns. It does what it needs to keep the game flowing, and it gave me enough to want to know how everything would play out in the overarching story and the characters. The visual presentation of Jedi Fallen Order impresses in a number of areas, but is also let down in several places that brings the aesthetic of the game down a little. The various planets offer gamers vast open world environments to play in, and each offers enough variety between each other for them not to simply be cut and paste. From the jungles and fog-laden landscapes of the Wookiee homeworld of Kashyyyk, the wet grasslands of Bogano, to the dusty, red-pinkish hue that blankets the landscape of Dathomir, its sun hanging low in the sky. Each is detailed well, from large buildings with its interesting architecture to going inside and exploring the multiple levels that exist within it. From the waterfalls that you see in the background that run down the sides of mountains to the underwater sections of Kashyyyk, or the rain falling as you explore this huge dungeon-like area. These are smaller details, but which add a lot to the world and makes exploring that much more interesting. Jedi Fallen Order can look stunning sometimes, such as the ripples through the water as the light hits the environment, but there were also a few times where the game looked a little average, as if the scene was devoid of any proper lighting or visual effects. And this somewhat lack of detail is extended to character models and faces as well in a few specific instances. The main character of Cal can look quite good with subtle facial movements at times, or his hair flapping in the wind or when sliding through the environment, or the movement of the eyes and blinking that looks natural enough to make it very believable and not awkward or bizarre. The alien captain of your ship, which is used to move between the planets, who goes by the name of Grease, looks great as well. But then we have Junda, who used to be a Jedi but is now aboard your ship. Many times during the movie sequences, she often seems to have this surprised look on her face no matter what she's saying. It's a little off-putting, and she lacks some of the detail and intricacies in her facial movement that other characters received. It isn't the worst I've seen, but it's but one example of where the game falls short. Animations can be quite good, especially once combat gets going, with the moveset blending from one to the next as the glow of your lightsaber swirls around the screen. Watching Cal climb onto ropes or hanging vines all look quite good, as does watching him squeeze through narrow crevices as he moves through to another area. A few blemishes do creep in though, but they weren't enough to detract from the game or something that made me focus on it for all the wrong reasons. At times, Cal's stance or his use of force powers can look unnatural. The animation when running or running along walls works, but it isn't flawless by any means. Then we get to the issue of performance. As is often the case these days, Jedi Fallen Order offers a resolution or performance mode on the more powerful consoles of the Xbox One X and PS4 Pro. Whilst not hitting true 4K in resolution mode, it's more disappointing that the performance mode, as with the case with Borderlands 3, cannot reach that 60 frames per second mark. It really never hits 60 frames a second apart from small indoor areas, and this was the case when playing on the Xbox One X. I'd rather play at a much more consistent 30 frames that the resolution mode offers than have the frame rate fluctuate so much during normal gameplay. What you prefer will differ depending on how susceptible you are to the frame rate dips, but the problem was exacerbated on the base consoles, with 30 frames being the highest frame rate available. I had a few situations on the Xbox One X where the game froze for a few seconds, and then problems are even greater on the less powerful systems. Load times are also of a concern, especially if difficulty is set high and you're dying a lot. Even on the X, load times will be over 15 to 20 seconds each time, and the number simply rises on the base Xbox and PS4. When it comes to the sound in the game, it's quite impressive with only a couple of what I consider to be minor blemishes. First up is the absence of the Star Wars theme, which is surprising, and for the purists out there, this will be much more of an issue than what I found it to be for myself. But for such an iconic piece of music to be absent, it seems strange, and I doubt Respawn simply forgot. It was an absence, but one I moved on from fairly quickly, as really every piece of music in the game, whether it be playing through action sequences or subtle ambient arrangements in the background during gameplay, each is classic Star Wars. The environment sounds also brought these locations to life, whether it be the sound of wind blowing or the sounds of wildlife off in the distance on the planet Kashyyyk. And then there's the classic sound throughout movie history. When your lightsaber ignites, it's always such a welcome sound, and the first part in making you feel like a Jedi before you run riot through a group of enemies. Hearing it take down enemies or hit objects all sounds as it should, with the clash of lightsabers being a highlight. Dialogue is mostly well written, but the real standout is the voice acting, which I felt was very good throughout the entire game, with special mention going to Grease, who sounded perfect for the character. Had a few funny comments, but also given times when he was more serious and conveyed a sense of weakness and fear. All of the main characters deliver great performances, and even hearing the stormtroopers chatter between each other is welcome just before you take them down. And that brings us to the gameplay and the influence of several other games that have clearly been an inspiration for how Jedi Fallen Order plays, with the likes of Uncharted, Dark Souls, and The Witcher 3 being looked to for how combat and world traversal will play out in Respawn's action game. Considering what the game was compared to when first shown off, we'll start with the climbing sections of the game and how it's been compared to the Uncharted series, which is a fair assessment. There are many times throughout the game where Cal will be required to climb up or down with the help of ropes, surfaces laden with vines, or sections of walls that are able to be gripped onto, or protrusions that can be climbed on. It's all very Uncharted, but it does work well with controls being responsive throughout these segments. But after so many of them, it also reminded me that when compared to the movies, there is just a huge amount of climbing in this game. Too much. It is necessary when the environments can have such verticality about them, but this is a Star Wars game after all, not an Uncharted game, and I felt with such an abundance of climbing sections, it broke up the combat, which is already being broken up by some simple yet enjoyable puzzles. But the one other game that Jedi Fallen Order has been compared to is that of Dark Souls due to the timing-based combat system whereby you need to wait for openings, otherwise you'll be punished by the enemies. But this was also required when playing The Witcher 3 on higher difficulty settings. I'll preface this section of the review by saying that I very much agree with adding different difficulty settings in Jedi Fallen Order, as opposed to the Soulsborne games where there are none. Star Wars has a huge fan base, some are hardcore gamers and some are casual, and each deserve to have access to the game and to play it at a difficulty setting that is comfortable for them. The story needs to be accessible for everyone, and it is because of the different difficulty settings. But if we are to compare Jedi Fallen Order to Dark Souls, then it does fall short in that regard. The combat of Dark Souls is often slower, but the mechanics are so solid and intricate that they work so well with the most basic of enemies through to the hardest of the bosses in the DLC. If you die in Dark Souls, then there is always a reason why. You didn't block when needed, you rushed in, you mistimed your attack, you parried late or early, or you're unfamiliar with a new enemy's moveset. You'll die in Jedi Fallen Order for much the same reasons, but I found the combat to be inconsistent at times. For example, I found the parry system could go from easy to trigger to wondering why it didn't work, and this was tested on all difficulty settings, where the timing becomes much more forgiving or difficult. Other times, enemies would block attacks in the middle of their attack animations, making them almost skip frames of animation in order to somehow block my attack. Rolling and dodging all seemed inconsistent at times, where I could have sworn I'd moved out of the way, but just got hit. And then other times, I would have thought that for sure I should have been hit. There were times where I was trying to fall off of a ledge or jump, but got stuck for some reason. The combat is fun when it all works, and judging against the likes of Dark Souls is perhaps unfair, as Respawn need to balance it over 4 difficulty settings. Parallels can most definitely be drawn between the two games when it comes to the save system as well, as Jedi Fallen Order has very much a bonfire-like system where you can rest, heal yourself, and allow your robot buddy BD1 to replenish his stimpaks. If you choose to rest and heal, then this makes the enemies reappear that you may have just defeated, so there is a risk-reward element to it. You'll be fighting the classic types of stormtrooper enemies, some boss fights against various types of foes, fighting off wildlife, plus some other enemies I won't spoil. The game is at its absolute best when performing aerial lightsaber attacks onto an enemy below, firing laser blasts back at the shooter, force pulling someone towards you and stabbing them, then throwing your lightsaber at someone else. At these times, when it all flows, then it can be incredibly satisfying. I do wish some of the moves that you unlock were open for players earlier in the game, so we have more time with them. I had the most enjoyment when fighting the stormtroopers in classic Star Wars fashion, but got over fighting the wildlife quite quickly, as I found them to be fairly uninteresting and mostly there for enemy variety. But as players defeat enemies, they will earn skill points which they can spend to unlock certain abilities such as the aforementioned force pull, but also being able to force push groups of enemies, making your lightsaber do more damage or increasing your maximum health and amount of force you have to use at once, for example. This added another layer to the game without it straying too much down the RPG or character building path. This is a third-person action game at its heart. I'd be interested to see if Respawn adds a new game plus mode in the future for even more challenge as well. As mentioned earlier, apart from fighting and climbing, players will also be solving some simple like puzzles to break up the gameplay, but you'll also be able to find echoes which can give additional lore information about a location or a person. Players will also be able to find upgrades and unlocks for their character and lightsaber. Clothing options for Cal's poncho, different lightsaber attachments and colours can also be found and equipped, but these sorts of collectibles isn't something I go looking for, as I'm not a completionist, but it's something for die-hard fans to go after. In terms of the game's length, you'll be looking around the 20-hour mark, but this can balloon depending on if you play on the highest difficulty settings and how much trouble you have with the enemies and bosses. It is a fairly long game and completely dwarfs the anemic single-player campaigns of the recent Battlefront games. The game does have padding due to the sheer amount of climbing sections, but also backtracking when going back to your ship to progress to the next mission. There are also a number of times when you'll be moving Cal through the tight crevices as mentioned before, which made me ponder whether these are carefully hidden loading screens between different areas. When we take Jedi Fallen Order as a whole, then it's a great game that Respawn has delivered, especially for Star Wars fans who have wanted a single-player game for years that was worthy of the license. It delivers fast, fun combat with all the moves that fans would want to use in a game such as this. It offers beautiful open-world environments with frantic action sequences and has a story and characters that are enjoyable without straying too much from what we've come to expect from Star Wars. The amount of climbing does detract from the overall experience and never quite reaches the heights of the games it tries to emulate.